So, I just finished reading Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. And a few months ago, I read Circe by Madeline Miller. They're both shortlisted for the Women's Prize. They're both feminist retellings of certain established Greek myths and or legends. But one is much better than the other. That one would be The Silence of the Girls. So, they're both up for the Women's Prize. They're both decent pieces of feminist literature, as far as I am one to say, given that I am a relatively cisgender white man. But The Silence of the Girls has a lot more value to it thematically, and I want to talk about that. So, Circe tells the story of Circe, who grew up on Mount Olympus amongst the pantheon of the gods, and then was banished to an island and became a witch. Throughout the story, she does a lot of impressive feats, godlike, hero-like feats, and at least what it seems like to me, the purpose of the book is very much to twist the typical Greek hero myth into something worthy of a woman. To put a woman in the place of someone like Heracles or Achilles or Odysseus or one of the gods who have all also done interesting things throughout their mythological lives. If you want to check out anything else about them, you can read Stephen Fry's Mythos, which is a little patronising, kind of written like it's for children, which it kind of is, but it's kind of irritating, but it's still good. Anyway, so Circe's good. It's a hero's tale for women, because the Greek myths were so skewed towards men and all of their wonderful feats and all of their wonderful deeds. So it seemed like Madeline Miller was saying, hey, let's do that only with women, or a woman, and a woman who is part of the Greek established mythos. So great, well done, that's fantastic. And it's well written. It's not particularly well paced, but it's eloquent, and the writing is tight, and particularly powerful in its description sometimes. And it's a very competent book. And I think if it wasn't up against The Silence of the Girls, or if The Silence of the Girls didn't exist, I'd be saying, well, here's a contender, a real contender for winner of the Women's Prize 2019. But The Silence of the Girls does exist, and I'm really glad that it does. So The Silence of the Girls and Circe both come from a suspiciously similar place in terms of the fact that they're both focusing on a character of Greek mythology who really did exist as part of that prose, or poetry, I guess, a part of that narrative of the ancient Greek narrative. But rather than a god that, like Madeline Miller focused on, Pat Barker has gone for focusing on a woman. This woman is Briseis. Briseis in the Iliad by Homer, she was an object of contention fought over between Achilles and Agamemnon. The Silence of the Girls follows the story of the Iliad, but it follows it from Briseis' perspective. Briseis was a queen. She was captured, and she became the sex slave of Achilles, and that is her position throughout the story, more or less. And she is an established part of the Iliad, but in this book you've got more or less her perspective. From about the 40% mark of the book, the perspective switches. It goes from just being a first-person account from her to also a third-person account focusing on the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. Their relationship is handled incredibly well, but I don't want to go over that in too much detail because I suppose it's a spoiler. Anyway, so Silence of the Girls, Pat Barker, really good book. Briseis, fantastic character. It's remarkable. It's remarkable how similar these two books are, Circe and The Silence of the Girls. While Circe is a hero's tale, inverted, gender switched, asking the question, hey, what would it be like if you had a typical hero's journey with gods and monsters and immortality and questions of existential dread and morality, all from the perspective of one of the women of the Greek pantheon and the Greek mythos. But The Silence of the Girls shines a light on the issues of storytelling in ancient Greece and storytelling throughout history. So much of our literary and storytelling and poetic narrative throughout all of Western history has been skewed towards men. In fact, I read an article recently discussing, and I cannot remember where I read the article, I'll link it when I've found out what it was, and it was an article discussing how women writers like the Brontes or Jane Austen, their most celebrated books might not actually be their best books, because their most celebrated books were chosen by male editors, male publishers, male critics, who deemed the books that they chose to be the least offensive, the least feminist, the least progressive, the most conservative, the most that maintained the male status quo. Therefore, it might be worth broadening your horizons when it comes to reading the women of Western classics and looking at their lesser known works, because they might actually be the better ones, because they're the ones that the men didn't want you to focus on as much. And that ties in brilliantly to The Silence of the Girls, which pleads with us to look at the status of women in these stories and how it represents women throughout history. Briseis is a slave. She's a sex slave. She's a relatively emotionally and intellectually tough woman in the story, but she is a slave. We've got this first-person narrative that demonstrates an incredible amount of turmoil, where she goes from wanting to escape to not wanting to escape, giving in to not giving in, fighting back to not fighting back, losing her strength to finding a second wind, across years of narrative. And this has so much more of a depth to it, a thematic and historic depth to it, because Briseis in the Iliad is nothing more than a plot device, a physical trophy, a sex object, an empty vessel for these men to project their worth, and something for these men to claim. And you know, we've always talked about trophies, trophy wives. It's a phrase, but this book really asks us to consider just how far back this goes, just how embedded into our narrative and into our literature and into our poetry, into our stories, this really is. And it's remarkable. And I guess I'm just annoyed that Circe has had so much more of a marketing push behind it. And ironically, I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying about women in the classics, certain books being pushed by publishers and booksellers more than others. Circe is very, very commercial. It is very viable as a good piece of cross-genre literature. It's literary fiction to a point, because it has a feminist stance. It is also Greek mythology, and I can attest to the fact that young boys, teenage boys, young men like myself, we fucking love Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Norse mythology. We like swords. We like swords and muscular men doing things, stabbing things with one tool or another. And so there's a draw with Circe. Is there an opportunity for young men specifically to read a Greek story that would appeal to them enough, and then get them to think about things from a more feminist stance, subtly embedding more feminist thoughts into their minds while they're reading a big gold book full of great heroes and gods? Yes, and that's fantastic. Well done, Circe. But The Silence of the Girls, it takes more bold risks. The sex that you see in it. It's more violent. It's more disgusting and disgraceful. There are not so many obscured, dramatized, or embellished aspects to the action, to the moments of battle and war, and it just seems to be more stripped bare and honest about its intentions. There's no sense of gratification, really. It's harsh, and that takes a lot more guts, I think, to do as a writer. And that might be that it limits its appeal. It might be that it's not for everyone in that regard because it's not so accessible. But like, fuck that. Accessibility is completely overrated when it comes to what we read and how we ingest fiction. But then I think that that's a fault of our education system, blah, 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 etc. I used to be a teacher. I know what that feels like. Yeah. So I'm not sure I've made my point specifically clearly, which is why this video exists in tandem with an article that I'll be able to get my point across with a little bit more grace when I actually sit down and think before I speak or type. Whatever. I just want people to know that if The Silence of the Girls doesn't win the women's prize, if the prize goes to Milkman, that's great. If it loses to Circe, that's a disappointment. I liked Circe. I think it's a good book. I think it deserves the praise that it's gotten. I just think that it was marketed more strongly, more powerfully, at least across the UK and the US, than The Silence of the Girls. And I think that that is a real disappointment from a feminist stance. And again, I'm a quasi-cisgender white man talking about this, and I'm aware of that, but I try my best to be a feminist. And I think this is a point that's worth making, isn't it? So, to anyone who's read Circe and enjoyed it, as I did, please read The Silence of the Girls. It's far more powerful. It takes more risks thematically. The Silence of the Girls teaches us the importance of women in fiction. It asks us to look at all of the films and books and video games and art that we've ever ingested and considered the women in those stories and what their stories are or could have been. And to look at the power dynamics at play. It's a book that could be extrapolated forever. It can be a book that you can apply to our modern day politics throughout history. It could you can extend it to narratives in fiction, religion, social dynamics and bonds. Look at the fact that statistically, when you walk down the street, women are more likely to move out of the way of a man who's barging down the street than a man is to move out of the way of a woman or another man. Men own the floor. And Pat Barker, in one way or another, deals with all of these issues, whereas Madeline Miller necessarily does not. She didn't have to. But she didn't. And Pat Barker did. And The Silence of the Girls needs more attention, it needs more readers, and at least over Circe, it needs to win.